Number 12. Carlos Condit was coming off a TKO loss to Tyron Woodley at UFC 171, where he suffered an injury during the fight and was out of competition for 7 months. In his return, he defeated Thiago Alves, who was unranked in the welterweight rankings, by TKO doctor stoppage at UFC Fight Night 67, which earned him a title shot against then champion Robbie Lawler. Robbie Lawler defeated Carlos Condit by a split decision. Although it was a great fight, many thought Carlos Condit won the fight. This fight may be considered Fight of the Year. Number 11. Tyron Woodley defeated rising welterweight contender Kelvin Gastelum by a split decision at UFC 183. He then was scheduled to face Johnny Hendricks at UFC 192 in a possible number 1 contenders bout. But just a day before the weigh-ins, Johnny Hendricks was admitted to the hospital due to an intestine blockage and the fight was called off. He decided to sit out for a year and a half to fight then champion Robbie Lawler. The two fighters met at UFC 201, where Tyron Woodley knocked out Robbie Lawler in the first round, becoming the new UFC welterweight champion of the world. Number 10. Lyoto Machida defeated Randy Couture by a jumping front kick at UFC 129, which earned him a title shot against then champion Jon Jones. Prior to his fight with Randy Couture, he was coming off a 2-fight losing streak with a knockout loss to Mauricio Shogun Rua and a close split decision loss to Quinton Rampage Jackson. He eventually faced Jon Jones for the title at UFC 140, where Jon Jones defeated Lyoto Machida by a guillotine choke in the second round. Number 9. Nick Diaz was scheduled to face Georges St. Pierre, who was the welterweight champion at that time, at UFC 143, but GSP suffered an ACL injury and was sidelined. Nick Diaz faced Carlos Condit for the UFC interim welterweight title and lost the fight by a unanimous decision. After the fight, he was suspended for a year for testing positive for marijuana. With not many contenders left in the welterweight division, Nick Diaz was still talking trash to Georges St. Pierre. After Georges St. Pierre made a recovery, he asked the UFC if he could face Nick Diaz next. The UFC granted Georges St. Pierre's wish and they both faced off at UFC 158 for the UFC welterweight title in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. During the fight, Nick Diaz was unable to get close to GSP to land any significant strikes. GSP kept Diaz at distance, mixing it up with some takedowns, and won the fight by a unanimous decision. Number 8. Dan Hardy was on a 7-fight winning streak and won his first 3 fights in the UFC against average welterweights before facing Mike Swick in a number 1 contenders bout at UFC 105, where he won the fight by a unanimous decision. This victory earned him a shot against then welterweight king Georges St. Pierre. Dan Hardy faced GSP at UFC 111, where Georges St. Pierre outclassed him in all areas of the fight, as well as exposing his wrestling defense. GSP won the fight by a dominant unanimous decision. Number 7. Demetrious Johnson had beaten majority of the fighters in the flyweight division and didn't have many contenders left to challenge him. With the number 1 contender at that time, John Dodson, out of action due to injury, the UFC was left with only a few options. In the end, Chris Carriasso had been given the opportunity to fight for the title in the main event at UFC 178. He was on a 3-fight winning streak and hadn't faced anyone in the top 5 in the flyweight division. In the fight itself, the champion Demetrious Johnson showed that he was just levels beyond Chris Carriasso in the striking and grappling aspects of the fight. He eventually finished the fight by a second round submission via a Kimura. Number 6. Jon Jones was scheduled to face Lyoto Machida again at UFC 152. Lyoto Machida declined to fight Jon Jones again due to the lack of time to train for the fight. Vitor Belfort, who was a middleweight at that time and was on a 2-fight winning streak, stepped up to face Jon Jones for the UFC light heavyweight title. Jon Jones won the fight by a submission via a Americana in the 4th round. Number 5. Urijah Faber defeated Frankie Saenz at UFC 194 by a unanimous decision, which gave him his second shot at the UFC bantamweight champion Dominick Cruz. Many fans argue that Urijah Faber didn't deserve that title shot at all, as he had been given too many title shots in the past, and that former UFC bantamweight champion TJ Dillashaw should have been given the immediate rematch after Dominick Cruz defeated him for the belt at UFC Fight Night 81. At UFC 199, Dominick Cruz defeated Urijah Faber by a unanimous decision. Number 4. With a 6-fight winning streak, Joe Soto was set to make his UFC debut against Anthony Burchak at UFC 177. The main event of the card was Renan Barão facing off against TJ Dillashaw for the UFC bantamweight title. On the day of the weigh-ins, Renan Barão was admitted to the hospital due to collapsing whilst cutting weight. In a last-minute replacement, newcomer Joe Soto was given the main event slot against TJ Dillashaw for the UFC bantamweight title. Even though Joe Soto gave TJ Dillashaw a good fight, TJ Dillashaw knocked him out in the 5th round to retain his belt. Number 3. Bethe Correia was granted the title shot at UFC 190 against then champion Ronda Rousey after defeating 2 of her teammates, Jasmine Duke and Shayna Baszler. She was on a 3-fight winning streak and hadn't faced anyone in the top 5 in the UFC women's bantamweight division. She campaigned for the title fight against Rousey, antagonizing the champion, mentioning that she would give Ronda Rousey the worst beating of her life. Ronda Rousey accepted her challenge and they faced off at UFC 190. In the fight, Ronda Rousey knocked out Bethe Correia in just 34 seconds, retaining her title. Number 2. Then UFC light heavyweight champion Jon Jones was set to face Dan Henderson at UFC 151. Dan Henderson suffered an injury and was forced to withdraw from the event. UFC middleweight Chael Sonnen, who was coming off a loss to then UFC middleweight champion Anderson Silva at UFC 148, stepped up to face Jon Jones on short notice. Jon Jones declined to fight him and the event was cancelled. With the fans wanting to see the fight, the UFC put the 2 fighters on the Ultimate Fighter and they eventually faced off at UFC 151, where Jon Jones defeated Chael Sonnen by TKO in the first round. Number 1. Brock Lesnar made his UFC debut with a record of 1-0 against Frank Mir at UFC 81 and lost the fight by a submission via a knee bar in the first round. He then faced Heath Herring and won the fight by a unanimous decision. The UFC then gave him a title shot against then UFC heavyweight champion Randy Couture. He defeated Randy Couture by TKO in the second round to become the UFC heavyweight champion of the world. It is crazy to think that Brock Lesnar lost his debut fight in the UFC and then won a fight to get a title shot with the record of 2-1. However, he was an incredible athlete and did go on to become one of the longer reigning heavyweight champions in UFC history.